everyone. We're just going to wait maybe 2 more minutes just to get, I think there's a few more folks jumping into the webinar, so we'll just wait maybe 2 more minutes and then we'll get going. Well, perfect. Well, I think we'll get started. Claire, Sam, we're live, right? Perfect. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Alex Kelly with ExcelinEd, based out of our Tallahassee office, and I'm our VP of Advocacy. And with me today, based out of our DC office, is Claire Voorhees. She is our Director of Federal Policy and our ESSA guru, and sometimes I think you're also going to hear Samantha Tankersley with our team as well, who's sitting behind Claire in the DC office. She's off camera right now, but I promise she's there. So thank you for joining us, and so this is our 5th ESSA webinar, although our first since May, because a lot's happened between now and then, and we really wanted the opportunity to catch up with any state partners or others who are interested in seeing where things are, learning from what's going on in other states, and kind of sharing in the different questions we have. We got a lot of questions for this webinar, so we'll probably in some cases just give you some high level of the slides and really try to focus more time on the questions we've been asked. But just to kind of maybe recap some of the things that have happened in the last several months. I think the summer and fall and winter is almost here, and states have been very busy with ESSA implementation. Obviously we've had a lot happen between now and then. So far, just to kind of give everyone some general numbers, at least 39 states so far have hosted community meetings, 39 that we know of that have hosted community meetings around ESSA to gather public input. 25 states have shared surveys with stakeholder groups to gather input on ESSA. 44 states have formed some sort of advisory committee. In some cases, some states have formed multiple advisory committees to provide input, and at least 13 states that we know of have actually posted their draft plans to the public. And I will also say, just a personal note, since we last did a webinar, I've got one of these. So I got married since our last webinar, so one of those has happened too. But anyway, just want to kind of jump right in. We'll go to the second slide. So a lot of questions that we've go one back, Sam. So a lot of questions that we've gotten have kind of said, where are we? We've had an election. We've had a lot of things going on. Where are we? And it's healthy to actually start with the big themes of ESSA, because one of our first things that we want to sort of remind everybody, we're trying to remind ourselves, is that we're still at a go-forward point. And in the context of what the federal law says is still ultimately the most important thing. The bottom line is the law is still the law. And so I'm not going to go over all of these, but I think it's particularly important just to highlight number 1 and number 2, just that a shift in authority did occur to the states, and that states have a tremendous, not unlimited, but a tremendous amount of flexibility. And I think it's important context for everyone to have that no matter what political questions may be out there, no matter what states may be trying to do to try to read the movements of Congress, of the administration, the bottom line is that the statute on the book still says what it does. So we're still at a go-forward point. We're still advising states and partners, departments of education and so forth to go forward. And really having that context in mind, I think is critical when you come across this sort of rumor mill type questions, and that is go forward, keep doing the work. You're going to probably hear us say that a lot in response to your questions and on some of these slides. And that's important because the bottom line is the right thing to do for kids in your states doesn't change. The right thing to do is still the right thing to do. And you know, we're going to talk about this a couple times. Having some continuity and having a system of education in your state and that is moving forward is ultimately so important for kids. So politics and rumors can't be a reason why we stand still. We have to keep moving forward for the sake of kids. Just to kind of move on to the second, I guess the slide number 3, the next slide. Just kind of want to talk about kind of, you know, maybe sort of the landscape of where we're at right now in terms of sort of the general sort of political impression, but also the policy impression of what's going on. I think that, you know, right now the conversation in a lot of states has been very focused on accountability indicators, which is important. Although I think a general impression that we're seeing so far is that it's maybe being done at the expense of conversations about interventions and assessments and options and flexibilities that states have. The school identification and intervention process is one that we really think states should be talking about. There's a lot in the federal law that can be taken advantage of in terms of what states can do, and so the accountability conversation is incredibly important, and it's the one that I think grabs a lot of headlines. But you know, we really are encouraging states to spend some of that time on interventions. We just published our intervention playbook just last week, and it's something that we'll be happy to send folks if you've not seen it. But I think it's an important observation that we shift the conversation. So far, it seems as though the standards question isn't really coming up all that much. I mean, some states have their natural occurring processes where they review state standards, and certainly you hear that question during the election season. But when it comes to real policymaking, it doesn't seem like the standards question is coming up much. It seems like it's kind of a stabilized topic right now. Now, anti-assessment backlash still exists in states to some degree. Some of that's just political and predictable, and then in other cases, you know, ESSA does open the door to folks to try to take advantage of the conversation. So that's still out there in some states, not all, but there certainly is a trend that just continues that conversation. An interesting point to make is that we're seeing a wide variety in stakeholder engagement, and this is something we've been getting a lot of questions about. It's not something we're necessarily tracking at a very detailed level. However, I think it's worth saying that some states really do appear to be making, I think, a good faith effort to engage a number of stakeholder groups the way the law requires. And then in other states, it's kind of a check-the-box exercise. So we're seeing a wide variety, and we would encourage states that if whoever the implementing, whoever's responsible in a given state, depending on state law, that the states really do bring in multiple diverse stakeholders for this process. You know, even with general political questions being out there, that engagement process is still critically important because these are rules and regulations that we're all going to be buying in on for a period of time, and so it's absolutely critical. And you know, a point that we've kind of now started getting into the habit of talking about with states, given sort of where the discussion's at, and the question is how can states have a voice at the federal level? Should they? What is it the state lawmakers should be doing? I've kind of hinted on this already, but really reminding everyone that that states have had multiple transitions in recent years, and that in of itself is a reason to really keep pushing forward with ESSA implementation at the state level, because we really owe it to the students and the schools, the teachers, the principals, to ensure continuity, ensure that our education system is ready for whatever exactly the final transition might look like. That stability is needed. Some states have had three different state tests in 3 years, and so no matter what the sort of federal outlook is, states need to keep pushing forward simply because state education systems need that continuity so they can provide a good education to students. So those are kind of some just sort of observations and comments on kind of where we're at in the implementation process. Claire is now going to take maybe a deeper dive, and then we'll start to open up some questions as we go along too. Claire, you want to take it from here for a little while?
Absolutely. And you want to, is there a question or two on those?
Yeah,
for Alex, Sam?
One question that came in, Alex, I think is a great one, is what states are seen as quote unquote taking the lead on ESSA? Any exemplar states that we can point to that are moving ahead very quickly and very well?
Yeah, sure. Some states that I think have been, well organized, particularly state departments or state boards, I think have been well organized and are doing a good job. I think Arizona, I think is progressing very nicely. Their state board, I think, has done a lot of really good work. Louisiana, their state board and superintendent there have done a really good job. And I think in their case, they're going to have to, I think the way their law is structured, they're going to have a legislative process there, although I think that the executive branch in Louisiana has done a good job to prepare for that. I think that South Carolina actually is doing a lot of good work. Their legislative committees actually are already involved, and I think South Carolina is moving forward nicely. There's probably a few more, but those are just a few to come to mind immediately.
And Alex, do we anticipate that accountability will be watered down in states? That was another question that we got. We addressed it a little bit here, but just to expand on that.
I hope not. There definitely will be. Yeah, I mean, there definitely will be attempts to. Although, obviously, what I call watered down, someone else might say, is not. So there's going to be disagreements about that. I think that there is. I think there is a political battle brewing in Oklahoma right now. Kind of battle lines are being drawn, I think, so to speak, although I think everyone's been friendly, but I think the reality is that there's going to be a real disagreement in Oklahoma right now. So there definitely are some states, although obviously I hope it's not too many. And so far, the good thing, even about in Oklahoma, where I think there is a stir happening right now, is that all the players involved have been listening and taking input. So even though there's a fight maybe about to happen, it's not for a lack of trying. There's actually good collaboration and listening going on. I think they're just genuine disagreements.
Gotcha. And then the last question we have touches on one we received separately as well as how are state legislators being utilized in the crafting of state plans by each state to meet the meaningful consultation requirement?
It varies wildly. Some not at all, and some pretty significantly. In some states, like in Alabama, just comes to mind. You've got lawmakers on the governor's. I forget if it's a committee or task force, but they're on the working group that's working on this. And then in other states, the lawmakers are at a distance from it, or if they're working on it, they're working on it purely from behind the scenes. So it varies pretty significantly, which should be a concern. I think it's prudent to, at the very minimum, if you're sitting in the position of working at a state education agency, I think it's very prudent to start at least pulling in your House and Senate Education Committee chairs, your members who tend to spend more time on these issues and tend to get them to a deeper level. If they're not involved, that should really be a concern. But it's a wild mix of involvement.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's the last for that slide.
Great. Well, thank you. And I think Alex said that winter is coming. For those of you in the D.C. area, we're in the middle of the polar vortex right now. And whoever's doing PR for the polar vortex deserves some applause. So what we're going to do here, we'll switch to the next slide. I should remind, we're heading into the particularly dense part of this presentation. We're going to walk through some of the final accountability regulations that have been released by the Obama administration. And I should say that we got a ton of good questions on the front end when you signed up. If you have additional ones, please send them in. They're always welcome. So what I'm going to do is walk through 2 slides on some of the top line accountability regulations, then switch to a check-in with the timeline and what the status of the timeline of implementation is, and then go from there to how we think, or our sense of how the transition to the Trump administration might affect that timeline and the regulation. So that's what's coming over the next couple minutes. And these first 2 slides in particular, they highlight some of the most significant provisions of the accountability regulations that were released a few weeks ago in final form by the Obama administration. And I should say also we're happy to answer questions on assessment regulations that have been released or supplement not the plant regulations that have been proposed, but that's not the focus of these next couple slides. Something to look at just at a high level when you're looking at this slide, at this chart, is that it compares the ESSA statute, the statutory language that passed, with the final regulations. And the reason for that is this really is the key question here. And you know that the final regulations should not be viewed in isolation, but really should be viewed in terms of what they add to or clarify about the statute. So it's always important to have a sense of what the statute said to understand the context for the regulations. And the other piece is that it's important to notice when you're making that comparison between the statute and the regulations, is notice that in a lot of areas, and particularly in the accountability provisions of ESSA, of the statute itself, it is fairly prescriptive. So it's not, there are areas of the law where states have unfettered flexibility. The accountability provisions are not among them. They're actually fairly prescriptive. And so the final regulation should be seen in that context. Another kind of thematic piece is that the final regulations are actually a pretty significant step back in a number of places from the proposed regulations. Think of a lot of the comments the U.S. Department of Education received on its proposed regulations, asked for increased flexibility or a scaled back version of those regulations. And in a number of places, as you'll see, the department listened. Just starting with a good example there is if you turn to the chart and the assessment participation or the opt-out piece of the regulations. Should be noted that as an example, the proposed regulations, and this relates to the statutory requirement that all states have to test 95% of their students, and if they fail to, if the school fails to, the state must factor that into the accountability system. And that's all the detail that the statute gives. What the proposed regulations did was give a list of proposed consequences for failure to test 95% of students, and then gave a final option which was anything the state decides to do that's equally rigorous. Well, this is a subtle change, but it gives a lot of flexibility. The final regulations say you could give some examples of some potential options for consequences, and then says, or anything that is sufficiently rigorous. So we've gone from equally rigorous to sufficiently rigorous, meaning it doesn't have to be as rigorous as the options listed in the regulations, but rather it can be anything the state deems to be sufficiently rigorous to ensure schools are aiming to test all of their students. You know, another theme to just view in terms of the final regulations, another theme is that a lot of questions that we've gotten have gotten at the idea of why do we need these regulations? Why is the statute enough? Does that give states enough information? And it's frankly a tough question to answer, and it's a close call. But I will say, in talking to states, that there is a feeling that there are a number of places in the statute, and we applaud Congress for their efforts, but it was not a perfect statute they passed, and there are a lot of areas that aren't clear, and that where the states could use some additional clarity, or where states might want to know, how can I be sure I'm complying with this? And the regulation fills in the piece of saying, well, here's how you can specifically apply, or you have flexibility, but this is one way you can be sure you're complying. And we found that in most of our conversations with states, some places not, but there are a lot of places where they do want that kind of clarity. An example is around minimum N. The ESSA statute says states set their own minimum N. As you recall, for those of you not in the weeds of this every day, minimum N is the minimum number of students that must be in a subgroup in order for that subgroup to validly count and to protect student privacy. So in order that subgroup to count in your accountability system. So statute says states set their own minimum N. The final regulations say states set their minimum N. If it's above 30, you need to justify it to the department. So you can see that's an interesting area where they've continued to give flexibility to states, but said if you're below 30, you're good. You're for sure good. You're not outside the scope of the law. So that's an example of how they kind of set those parameters, but still give some flexibility. Other key pieces in this piece of the accountability regulations, you'll note the top line, the plan submission deadline. The statute, the ESSA statute simply requires that the accountability requirements go into effect in 2017-18. The final regulations released by the Obama administration says that state plans must be submitted in either April or September of 2017, and states get to choose between those two dates. Another important provision in the final regulations is around summative ratings, something you may have all heard about in the law, discussed as a matter of some controversy during the regulatory process. So what ESSA requires is that states must annually, meaningfully differentiate among schools. And if you're a common sense thinker, you say, what the heck does that mean? So what the proposed regulations said was that meant that every state had to have a single summative rating for its schools, either when the indicators all combined into one final grade, A through F, 5 stars to 1 star, some sort of summative rating. The final regulations no longer require that summative rating. Instead, they say you can satisfy the requirement of annually meaningfully differentiating among your schools by simply using the 3 categories that are in the law, if a state so chooses. So you're already in another part of the law required to identify schools for comprehensive or targeted support. So the final regulations say as long as you have schools that are either in a comprehensive, targeted, or other category, you meet that requirement. Now, I will say from ExcelinEd's perspective, that would be a huge missed opportunity, and we see tremendous value in giving a summative rating and sending, and the message that sends both to schools and the information it sends to parents, but that's no longer required in the final regulations released by the Obama administration. One other key piece of the puzzle here, accountability indicators. As you recall, the ESSA statute requires that states include 4 indicators in their accountability system, and it around achievement, growth, grad rate, English language proficiency, and it's combining. I'm saying 4 because grad rate and growth are kind of combined into one in the law, and then an indicator of school quality or student success. The final regulations go a step beyond that and say not only do you have to have those 4 indicators, but when you're reporting on those indicators, you must establish at least 3 performance levels within those indicators. And interesting, something we actually view as an additional requirement added by the regulations, but it essentially means that you couldn't just say that your students had an average score on your test, achievement score of 287 points. You'd have to say 287 points is either high, medium, or low, or good, bad, or ugly. You have to have that additional performance level within each indicator. There's, we could spend all day on these. As Alex said, we wanted to minimize our time on the slides because it's right there in front of you. Please add additional questions in. We have a ton of good ones that that were sent in. Sam, if you want to pick some that seem most relevant to this slide?
Yes, we actually have one come in right when you're talking about it. Just to kind of expand on what you mentioned from Gary in Michigan. So you referenced the requirement on annually meaningfully differentiating schools. Yet the Michigan DOE is proposing to put A through F letter grades out once every 3 years. Any insight into what the pushback for that could be? Just providing a little context around that.
Right. Well, I'd say, from my ExcelinEd advocacy hat on, I would say, or Alex, if I can borrow your hat for a moment, I would say, we would hope it's a winter hat these days. But I would say that, I would say best practice, certainly as an organization, we would say based on all our experience in states, that the power of that grade is greatly diminished if there's not earned annually. If you think if a kid enters in 3rd grade, you really want to wait till 6th grade for that child's school to receive another grade. So we think that's a missed opportunity in terms of state policy. Looking at the letter of the law in the final regulations, as long as you annually categorize schools according to comprehensive, targeted, and other, I think you would meet ESSA's requirements. I should say the other negative there, though, is that you generally want to have a unitary system. And what we mean by that is, in the past, under No Child Left Behind, sometimes states had their federal categories and their state categories. They had A through F over here and federal identifications over here. And we feel that really weakened systems, confused parents, and sent a lot of mixed messages. So I would say probably permitted under the law, under these versions of the final regulations, not best practice in our view.
Absolutely. So how many states that we know of, or do we believe, are considering substantial weights for their student success indicator?
Great question. I would say we don't know yet, and this is the so-called 5th indicator, the so-called non-academic indicator, even though it does not have to be non-academic. That's getting a whole lot of attention. We'd say maybe too much attention these days, disproportionate attention. We don't know yet. Most states, even the ones that have, the 13 that have released draft plans, a lot of those kinds of details are not yet in it, especially when it gets down to weighting. Some of those just have lists of potential school success indicators, school quality indicators. But I will say there are limits on it in the final regulations. There are limits on how much weight you can give to your school quality indicator. And it's kind of funny. It's not a direct limit. It's sort of an indirect limit. If you'll indulge me in this this description, but basically what the final regulations say is the school quality indicator, performance or improvement on that indicator should not, you have to put the weight on it, should be such that performance on that indicator doesn't get a school out of being identified. So in other words, it can't, if a school would have been targeted support or would have been comprehensive support based on its performance on those other indicators, it can't be the school quality indicator that shoots it up to a B because it has so much weight. It's a kind of a side-handed way of making sure that that indicator stays relatively small, and that the indicators that have to be based on student outcome measures and that have to be academic have the majority of the weight in your system. So we don't know what states will weight that indicator, but that weight can't be huge within the system.
Perfect. You want to do one more? You want to move on to the next one?
We maybe do one more.
Okay. Let's do, so with the new data reporting requirement, what capacity issues need to be addressed in order to satisfy the data request? That's a big question.
Yeah, that's a huge, just a huge question on on reporting requirements that are not covered in detail here in this chart, but ESSA continues all the reporting requirements at the state and local level and school level that existed under prior versions of the law, and added some pretty challenging ones, which are really valuable tools for advocacy and important information, but will be challenging for states. One of the top of the list there is the schools within states within the next couple of years will have to report data on per pupil funding by source. So they'll have to have their data systems in order so they can say, you know, student X, when a student in this school gets X from federal funds, you know, Y from state funds, and Z from local funds, and you know, that's going to be a challenge for a lot of state systems. What I'll say, sort of just generally about reporting here in ESSA, is that there's a huge opportunity for states. There's more data requirements, so a bigger challenge, and to date, we've found, and a recent great resource from BQC found that the current state of school report cards is not good at all. I think they found that 4 states are applying with No Child Left Behind requirements that should have been 14 years ago. So there's a huge challenge here, a huge opportunity. States have to get their data houses in order so that they're better reporting the things that are already required by the law. They then should shift to trying to focus on how are we going to meet these new requirements, especially around this all-important equity measure of how much funds per student every school is receiving. And then the third piece of this is states then need to, we think, go a step further beyond compliance and really start reinventing how they interact with parents with that school report card, and creating something that's not just a spreadsheet that has good data in it, but a you know, a powerful, user-friendly tool that is interactive and really is 21st century. Someone told me today the way, you know, you can go online and do your fantasy football team all on your phone, and yet we're just handing parents spreadsheets. We really got to upgrade those to 21st century. A lot of organizations are doing some good work on this. We are, as an organization, developing a model template for school report cards based on Florida data that we can also share with folks. Send us an email. It shows really what a 21st century report card should look like, and that we hope states get there.
Perfect. Thank you, Claire.
Next slide. So we'll spin through this, and what this continues on these really the same themes around the so this is staying with the accountability regulations, but shifting away from school accountability to identification and interventions in particular. You know, the same themes hold true in this area of the regulations. You know, the first being that there's really greater flexibility in some places when compared to the proposed regulations. A good example of this is around identifying targeted support schools. As you recall from our earlier webinars, I'm sure, that the ESSA statute requires that states identify for targeted support schools with, quote, consistently underperforming subgroups as determined by the state. The proposed regulations gave states a list of various ways they could identify what they could define consistently underperforming subgroup. In response to some pushback around that, the final regulations do not define what a consistently, or give even recommendations for what a consistently underperforming subgroup is. That'll be completely left up to the state. However, in the final regulations, they do require that states look at no more than 2 years of data unless they can justify looking for longer. So the kind of strong recommendation of the regulations is that you look back at performance of 2 years of performance to see if a subgroup is underperforming. But you can request longer time if there are reasons within the state to justify that longer timeline. other theme that's consistent here is that the regulations provide some important clarity around some areas that weren't clear in the statute. An example of this is identification of comprehensive support schools, which, as you recall, are your very lowest performing schools in the state. And those are the bottom 5% of Title I schools and any states with grad rates less than 67%. The final regulations clarify that when looking at schools and whether or not they have a grad rate less than 67%, states have to use a 4-year grad rate. There was some question whether could states use a 4-, 5-, 6-year grad rate to look when identifying those schools with low grad rates, and the final regulations say no, it has to be that 4-year grad rate. You can use 5-year and 6-year grad rates for other purposes, but for this purpose it has to be the 4-year grad rate. The other key piece of the final regulations here, I think that is the most note to states is the top line here, which is the timeline for interventions. Another source of much controversy in the proposed regulation. The ESSA statute simply says that accountability requirements go into effect in the 17-18 school year, and that left states and others wondering, so what does that exactly mean? If they go into effect in the 17-18 year, when do you need to identify new schools? The proposed regulations called for a tighter timeline. The final regulations make it very clear that states must identify a new set of schools. In the 17-18 school year, states must have their new accountability systems, those new indicators, in place. Then that year, based on the data that year, they must identify a new set of schools, and those schools begin interventions in the 18-19 school year. And we'll look at the timeline a little bit further, but that gives states a little bit more breathing room, and I think was really one of their top line concerns. I should say, though, putting the advocacy hat back on, is that there's no reason for states to sit on their hands until the end of the 17-18 school year. These interventions, many of these schools have been failing for a number of years, and so while ESSA's technical requirements technically go into effect there, it doesn't mean that states have to be on that timeline. Failing schools and the kids in those schools should be receiving interventions as quickly as possible, and every year, in fact. So that's our, again, borrowing Alex's hat there. I'll skip some of the other pieces because they're right there on the slide for you. Any relevant questions there, Sam, on that?
Yeah, so what is the best way to assist districts in implementing evidence-based intervention? And I've gotten this question before.
Okay, yeah, that's a popular question. So, and this I really need to give a nod to our the interventions playbook that we just put out, that we are happy to send to folks, or that's available on our website. What the intervention playbook does is really provide an answer to this question, but in as few words as possible. Our playbook talks about, and what we recommend, is a rigorous state role in interventions. The ESSA statute gives a lot of authority, transfers a lot of authority around interventions from the federal government down to states and districts. And the thing about the law is if a state doesn't want to take a rigorous role in interventions, they can pass most authority just down to the district, so that those districts with failing schools will can be sort of left on their own to address those failing schools. We recommend that states take a much more rigorous approach to pushing and encouraging and supporting districts in implementing the kind of rigorous interventions, and especially choice-based, leveraging choice-based interventions. And here's how, there's kind of 3 ways a state can do that. The first is, as you'll see here on one up from the bottom, states can create a list of interventions, and the final regulations require that districts, if a state creates a list of evidence-based interventions, the districts must choose from it. So that's a big piece of state authority around interventions. The second is the state has the ability to approve improvement plans. So districts have to develop improvement plans for these failing schools, and states get to approve them. So we encourage states to take a rigorous approach to that and to not approve plans that are weak and that don't take on plans for rigorous evidence-based interventions. And finally, the third thing a state can do is distribute school improvement funds through competitive grants. Part of 7% of Title I funds are for school improvement. The state can either pass those through the district as block grants, or can hold it back and use it as a competitive grant, giving it only to those districts that agree to do the kind of interventions that the state wants to see. So that's the kind of short answers, the short summary, although I encourage you to still read our, our interventions playbook that walks through that in a little bit more detail.
And then the last question, related, separate but related, can you just provide an update on where we stand with supplement not supplant?
Oh, good. Sam always picks out the really the light questions here on a
maybe what to
Thursday
expect
afternoon
coming on the pipeline.
Yeah, so without getting into all the details and drama of supplement not supplant, it's probably the most controversial piece of the regulations that we expect. This deals with the requirement in federal law that Title I federal funds are used to supplement and not supplant state and local funds. So states and districts aren't allowed to give schools less funding just because their schools are eligible for Title I. And the ESSA statute gave some states some more flexibility, or appeared to give the states some more flexibility about how they comply with that law. And the Obama administration, in its proposed regulations, was pretty prescriptive, and many felt overreached on implementing that requirement. And there's been a huge backlash from states, from unions, from Congress on that proposed regulation. So we're all on the edge of our seats, waiting to see what the final regulation is, and we expect that sometime between now and the end of the Obama administration. And the future of that regulation we'll kind of get to in the next couple slides here.
Okay,
cool. So timeline. This provides I've gotten into some of this already. Some of the updated timeline around. I've already talked about what the federal government is doing. The Obama administration is rushing to complete all of its regulations by the time President Trump takes office. The state timeline I've talked about, actually covered in some detail as well, which is the new plan submission deadlines, and also when this slide does a good job of showing that 17-18 school year is when the new accountability systems must be in place. So as soon as possible, once those plans are approved, states have to have their ESSA compliance systems in place. And then based on that year, the results of that year, in 18-19, that new set of schools will be identified for comprehensive and targeted support, and they can receive their interventions. So hopefully that helps clarify that piece a little more, but also happy to answer any questions that raises.
Only one more question.
Sure.
How many states will delay their submission of state plans as a result of final regulation?
So, great question. I don't know, the plan submission deadlines between the proposed and the final regulations shifted about 2 or 3 months back. And also during that time period, Donald Trump was elected president, so a lot has changed in people's views. So I wonder, I haven't heard yet. I wonder, Alex, if you've heard whether states are shifting their timelines greatly or kind of continuing on their same trajectory in terms of plan implementation.
Yeah, in the last couple of weeks, I've definitely heard of 6 or 7 states that have solidified September as their target. I mean, there were some states that, because of things like the timing of their legislative sessions, they already knew that either the March or March or the was it originally July were the better times. But I've heard now in the last couple of weeks a few states say that it's September.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, I don't think we've heard of any states, you know, that may be delayed to that September. I don't hear of any states who are planning to just sit and wait and see what happens with the transition to the new administration. I think really that the trains have continued moving, which is a good thing. So we've done a mean thing here on a busy Thursday afternoon, and probably saved till the end the big reveal here, which is the remaining uncertainties around the transition to the new administration. And to skip to the punchline that maybe you all were waiting for is that we don't know exactly what is going to happen to the timeline and to the regulations in light of the transition to the Trump administration. I'd like to take a minute to walk through the potential options, but I'll say that I think the reason that we don't know, that no one knows, is that I'm pretty confident that the Trump administration does not yet know, nor does Congress know. Everybody is looking at this situation and trying to figure out, it's a pretty unique to be transitioning to this major new law right as we transition parties and to a new kind of administration is really set everyone back and made us realize that we're not so good at predicting things, and maybe we should wait it out a little bit here. And so one of the, but I think it is important for folks to understand what the options are. So this slide attempts to lay that out. There are, and it asks questions of what is the future of the regulations, of the Obama administration's regulations on the 3 to 4 topics that they've released so far or are about to release. So as you recall, accountability, 2 different assessment regulations, and the supplement not supplant regulations will, we think, all be final by the end of the Obama administration. So what happens to those regulations, and do they stay in effect? In terms of what the Trump administration could do, the administration, there are kind of 4 options in 2 different buckets. One is that administration could keep those regulations in place, and if they do that, they could decide to keep them in place while re-regulating on certain pieces of them. For example, if they don't like the regulations around accountability indicators, they could just re-regulate on those pieces. Alternatively, they could keep the regulations in place and use sort of more informal tools, such as non-enforcement or waivers, to just decide not to enforce certain pieces of the regulations. The second bucket would be if the Trump administration decides to rescind the final regulations or to pull them. And because these Obama regulations were released so close to the end of the administration, the Trump administration would have authority as soon as they take office just to pull them. They don't have to go, because they were so late in the administration, they don't have to go through a formal process. If they so chose, they could pull the regulations. To be clear, they can't pull certain pieces within those regulations. They would have to pull accountability as a whole or leave it, assessments as a whole or leave it, supplement not the plan as a whole. They can't pick and choose pieces within those buckets. If the Trump administration decides to rescind those regulations, they could either decide to they could start the regulatory process all over again, or they could and do the whole thing over in their vision, or really do minimal regulations and just turn to guidance and only regulate on the bare minimum things. For example, I believe they have to regulate around the state plan process. They're required to in order to stand that up. So those are the possibilities, the decisions presented to the Trump administration. On Congress's side, Congress, separate and apart, and of course they'll be communicating with each other, but Congress also has its own authority, and it's called the Congressional Review Act. And what that does is it's a statute that allows lawmakers, if they have 60 votes, within 60 legislative days, to vote to repeal regulations. It requires a simple majority in Congress, but it also requires presidential approval or enough votes to override the veto. The reason I might sound hesitant is that there's not a lot of clarity around the Congressional Review Act. It's only been used once in history, and that was by President Bush in 2001. I believe it was an environmental regulation. Like with the Trump administration's approach, if Congress decides to rescind these regulations, they'd have to do each one as a whole. They couldn't decide to rescind just pieces of it. Looking at our time here. So those are the possibilities that are in front of the administration and Congress. As I said, again, we don't know, and I don't believe anybody knows exactly what's going to happen. There are factors before I turn to Alex and talk about what states should do in light of this uncertainty. One more layer here is what are the factors that affect which direction that the administration or Congress could go. I pulled out a couple. One is just the politics of transition. We're hearing a lot from Capitol Hill that there's a desire to invoke the Congressional Review Act pretty aggressively, and that there'll be kind of sweeping, and you have to vote on each separately, but there'll be an effort to pull back a ton of Obama regulations in lots of different areas. I think that will affect where we end up. If there's a lot of energy to pull and vote on regulations, it's possible, or maybe more likely, that these education regulations get swept up in that kind of fever. Another big factor here is Senator Lamar Alexander. He is the chairman of the Senate Education Committee, and he is, part of his legacy is helping to pass and being instrumental in the passage of ESSA, that he views as a law that passed authority back to the states. It was a reaction to the No Child Left Behind Act and ESSA and waivers. So he may feel driven to pull back on some of the regulations that he sees as an overreach, and overreach when compared to the statute. Two other big factors. One is who is going to have the ear of this administration. We know who the Secretary of Ed nominee, Betsy DeVos, is going to be. We don't know who will be around her, who her Deputy Secretary will be, who will be in the White House and the Domestic Policy Council. So who will be contributing to that decision is still up in the air here in Washington. And finally, and this is, Alex raised this point at the beginning, but what kind of role are states going to play? We think states have a huge, state and advocates like yourselves have a huge voice here. If states cry out and call for these regulations to stay in place, for the timeline to stay in place, and for implementation to proceed in light of all the uncertainty that we've had in education for a number of years, that can, we believe, play a huge role in an important political voice that we think it would be a shame we're missing from the debate. We have 5 minutes. I don't know if we have time for. Why don't we have Alex close out? If we have time for questions, we'll wrap those in. That work, Alex?
Perfect. And so just to kind of recap some points. So we've talked about a number of reasons why states need to continue going forward. I just want to add one other reason. Some are already identified on the slide there, but the other reason to remember is that the sort of anti-accountability forces are not taking a pause. So if there's questions about, well, federal regulations, and really I think the questions that Claire just presented on the preceding slide, just remember that if you're on the pro-accountability side, the anti-accountability side is not saying, oh, let's take a pause for a little while and see what happens. So don't lose momentum. We've seen some really incredible coalition work in states that really deserves to be complimented in dozens of states. And I think the question was asked earlier about what states are doing well, and the states that are doing well a common point in all of them is there's a really good coalition working hard on this issue, and they're supporting their Department of Education, which is just something I'll plug there as well. You know, support our chiefs, support our departments of education. They need the advocacy community to be there with them and help them through this process. Don't let them go it alone. In those states that are doing well, coalitions are working hard to divide up the different tasks involved in this, take public input, make sure diverse players are at the table. And so don't let that good momentum, especially as most states start their legislative sessions in January, don't let that good momentum just stall out right now, because we need it for so many reasons. And again, the point that we've made that so many states have already gone through major transitions in accountability in recent years, new tests, new systems, and so to make sure that we come out of this process with some continuity for our state's education systems, we need that work to continue. And just kind of maybe I'll give an alarming example of one case where I got really concerned the other day. The other day I was talking with a governor's office of a state that overall I've actually thought their process was going really well. I won't name the state. I thought their process was going really well, and actually I really like where they're at in terms of developing their ESSA accountability plan. However, I talked to the governor's office of that state the other day, and they said, we really feel like we've been left out and have had no say in this process. And whether or not their feeling is their reality, that is a major red flag. If you have a significant player like that, I certainly understand in some states there may not be a political opportunity for a state DOE and a governor or legislature to work together. This particular state, they definitely should be, and that should be a major red flag. If you have ed committee chairs, governor's offices, or other major advocacy organizations saying, you know, we really haven't been involved in this process, that is a major red flag, and fix that now. Fix that problem now, bring them in to the fold as quick as possible, because as the slide notes, our ultimate point is we really need to keep our heads down and continue this momentum, keep moving forward. A lot of great work's gone into this, and so regardless of the uncertainties from that were mentioned on the prior slide, let's keep going forward. With that, any more questions that we have, Sam, that we can answer?
No additional questions, and I think we're good.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, so we encourage you to, we've mentioned a lot of things. Please follow up. There's our info. You know where to find us. It's a pleasure, and as we tell folks when we see them, this is what we do. Our job is to help you all sort through the policy challenges and the many advocacy challenges and opportunities ahead. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you in the new year. Stay warm, as we freeze. Yeah.